sorry, of course, that we could not meet last week because, of course, it puts us behind about a week. But we're recording this presentation so that students can look at it before next Tuesday, so that they'll have a framework for where we're going with our class this semester. The other piece is that on Tuesday, our game plan is that our presenter, Dr. Kelly Stoney, will be with us, and she'll begin right at 6 o'clock for the class, and so we'll have her presentation first, and then we'll be introduced to the syllabus, to the class, and kind of pick up where we left off at. It may not make any sense to the students, but at least for my sake and Elaine's sake, that we'll trying to stay with the presenters who agreed to be with us and whose schedules are tight, and so that would be the game plan. What I want to do with this presentation is that this, I think, is pivotal in terms of persons understanding the background of Native American tribes in the state of Oklahoma and also Kansas and Missouri. We'll talk about Missouri toward the end, and for that and the fact that there are no federally recognized tribes in the state of Missouri. So therefore, we're looking right across the border in Kansas and, of course, Oklahoma, recognizing that many of the St. Paul students are from the Missouri area and also, of course, from Oklahoma and probably that place in between for that. So that's what I want to begin with, is talking about some of the historical background for these particular places there. And throughout the semester, we'll reference back to some of this presentation, which will be helpful for us when we look at that. When we look at Oklahoma tribes, I'll begin with Oklahoma because that's what I'm most familiar with, and I have a good piece on the Kansas tribes as well. Only 2 of the 39 federally recognized tribes in the state of Oklahoma today are indigenous to Oklahoma. The Caddos and the Wichitas, who really were part of Texas history, Oklahoma. They were the only 2 tribes that were here before the rest of us were. So that meant that the rest of us, the 37 other tribes, were removed not just from the southeastern part of the country, but also from all over the country to this place. Many tribes had passed through Oklahoma, of course, especially the Plains tribes, who were nomadic tribes on the way to Texas and Mexico. People such as the Osage tribe and the Comanches and the Apaches. And so they would have been familiar with, at least with the western part of the state, and maybe a few other parts of the state for that. But which again, reminders the rest of the tribes were removed from ancestral homelands or areas. And the tribes that I don't talk about are the tribes that are no longer, that were decimated. Tribes that were small, either were merged with other tribes, but you'll see some list of tribes of Oklahoma, and those tribes simply do not exist anymore in today's history. What's important is when we talk about, for our sake, for this class, when we talk about the history of Christianity for the Native American tribes, it's important to know that for this part of the country, it really began with the southeastern tribes. Tennessee, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, especially Alabama. That was what Hominoli talked about in his book, The First White Frost, that we'll reference to throughout the semester, is that he said the southeastern section was the cradle of Native American Methodism in the South. And so when I talk about that, I'm referring, of course, to what's here in the state of Oklahoma. That region was heavily populated by many, many tribes, some who are still there today, some of those not federally recognized, but recognized by the states, primarily farmers who lived in those settled communities. What we'll find out about the southeastern tribes is that those tribes were farmers, agriculture. There were folks who were not nomadic. They had no need to follow the buffalo for their existence, as we'll talk about later for the Plains tribes. And so that's always been the home areas. And so therefore the interaction with those early white settlers is what was pivotal in terms of how our lives were changed. But in addition to farming, the tribes would carry on commerce with themselves among other tribes, always had something that others needed, and that was important to the lives. We'll talk about family groupings throughout the semester, and this will be most important. Muskogean group, of course, we know the town of Muskogee in the area, but this refers to the language group, who primarily are the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Seminoles. We won't talk about this a lot, but really the Choctaws and Chickasaws at one point in history perhaps were the same people. Our language is very, very similar. There's legend stories about how our group used to be together and how we became the Chickasaws and the Choctaws. Creeks and Seminoles are the very same way. They both the language is very, very similar. They understand each other's language. And at one point in history, perhaps where the tribes divided up and, of course, are identified today as separate people there. And we also look, this is always interesting because folks hear often about what we call the 5 tribes, 5 civilized tribes. And the Cherokees are grouped with that, but the Cherokees really were Iroquoian in terms of their family group, and they're not a Muskogean group. They were different than us, but because of their location in Indian Territory in Oklahoma, they're often grouped as the 5 tribes. And so we'll talk about that and perhaps some of the differences or similarities for that. All of those are known today as the 5 civilized tribes. That's a historical term. You don't hear many of us referring to ourselves as civilized unless we may be joking with the western tribes and northern tribes who sometimes know us as that, and we'll talk more about that later. These tribes were permanent communities, as I talked about, been there for years and years and years in that part of the country, very close-knit. The tribal economy, because of their livelihood, was based on agriculture. These large farms were used to supply the community with food, and the surplus that they raised was used as trading with the other tribes. And I'll talk, I think, more about this later when we look at how it was that some of the tribes finally end up ceding the lands for lands here in Indian Territory. These tribes are made up of clans, tribal towns, and districts, especially today among the Seminoles, Creeks, and among the Cherokees. They still are very familiar with their clans, with their tribal towns. If you talk to Creek people, Muskogee people, Cherokee people, Seminole people, they can tell you what their clan is. Majority can because it's still used today. They can tell you what their tribal town was. For Choctaws, it's not so much true today because the Oklahoma Choctaws was so Christianized that we lost a lot of that on our removal. The Mississippi Choctaws can still refer to that, but the Oklahoma Choctaws really can't do that. This is very important because it's still practiced a little bit today, but matters involving everyone was decided in a tribal council. It wasn't just up to one individual to make the decision on behalf of everyone, but it was made upon a tribal council. Historians will tell, when you read some of the history, it drove some of the early European settlers crazy because they weren't used to that kind of decision making. One person had an authority to make that, and historians talk about how difficult that was for them to understand that. When we talk about the pre-removal period, I'm talking about the period before Indian Territory became Oklahoma, and so we're talking about that time frame. The French, British, and Spanish, of course, were all countries who were seeking to gain control of these new lands, and many who had a historic relationship with the tribes. So the southeastern tribes were allied with the French, with the British, and the Spain. Whatever we needed from those countries, what they had to trade, was where they happened to go. Historically, you'll see that the Cherokees allied with the English, the Choctaws allied with the French, and the Creeks themselves, historians say, really tried to remain neutral and bartered perhaps with all those different groups. Today, if you look at some of the dress of the Cherokees and the Choctaws, you'll see that French influence and some of the regalia and some of what they deal with in their lifetime. But that was interesting because it has an effect on us later, especially with the Civil War. After the Revolutionary War, it was inevitable that immigrant persons, and that's what Hominola refers to, anyone who was not a part of the country at that time, folks who immigrated to this part of to this country, they would begin moving in to the territory of the tribes. Remember, this is a perfect land, farming, good places for folks to live at, and all sorts of other things that would come to be very important for that immigrant community. And at first, the folks were small in numbers who would come and move in among these southeastern tribes. And if you lived among the native people in the area, you had to live according to the laws of those tribes. But as the numbers grew, so did their desire for land. And soon the immigrant community would become very large in that place. I included this quote because when we look at our history, it's often defined by, of course, by the writer. And this is a historian, non-Indian historian who writes. He said, when after the discovery of America by Columbus, and of course most native persons would not say that, It was first traversed by men from the civilized nations. It was inhabited only by beasts and birds native to the forest, and by tribes of men of savage natures, of superstitious sentiments, of rude customs, and of vulgar habits. And so that reminds us right there that the writer already had a bent toward what would happen, not really understanding as missionaries would later what they viewed as superstitious was very important to the native people for that. What I had wanted to show, but could not today, but will later, was talking about the historical piece in terms of the Cherokees, in terms of what caused that removal period. In 1824, President Monroe had recommended that the land west of Missouri and Arkansas be set aside for colonization. Well, his idea, and it wasn't really his idea. This idea came up from all sorts of leaders from at that particular time, non-Indian, was that all the tribes across the country would be moved to one central place, what they would call Indian Territory, which really was part of what we now know as Oklahoma, parts of Kansas, and area further up above Kansas. Colorado was a part of that. It was really a wide area that would be set aside for that. Monroe was the one who recommended it. Again, had been talked about many years before. But Andrew Jackson was the one who had the task of carrying out that plan. As he was, of course, a military leader, many of his battles were against Native people. And as he became president, perhaps that gave him more of an avenue to carry that out. Of course, none of these tribes were interested in leaving their homelands. That's all they knew. That's where they were at. Many tried to work through the governmental system. What's important to note is that especially the Choctaws and Cherokees, historians would say, had some of the best educational systems in the country among any groups of people, were very knowledgeable about land, understood how the other governments worked. The Cherokees, of course, who from their language group would have understood how to work tribal governments. And so they understood that, and they understood because of the early intermarriage, many Choctaws, Cherokees, probably not as much among the Creeks, but the Cherokees and Choctaws had a lot of intermarriage with the white settlers that would come into the area. And so because of that, they understood, learned the ways, were part of their educational system, so forth and so forth. So they knew how that worked, and so they tried to find the proper avenues to make that work. The Choctaws themselves had already signed a treaty many years before, which was called the Hopewell Treaty, and others may refer to this when they come to do their presentations, 1785 to 86. And many other southeastern tribes, most of the southeastern tribes, have signed this treaty as well. And here's what it basically said, that the said Indians for themselves and their respective tribes and towns do acknowledge all the Choctaws to be under the protection of the United States of America and of no other sovereign whatsoever. Of course, the United States, understanding that the French were still there, the Spanish were still there, the British who were still doing trading and coming around, and tribes who were still being, giving them some of their allegiance, if you will, because of past history. It also fixed the boundaries of the tribes, and Article 9 reads, for the benefit and comfort of the Indians and for the prevention of injuries or oppression on the part of the citizen or Indians, the United States and Congress shall have the sole and exclusive right of regulating trade with the Indians, managing all their affairs in such manner as they think proper. They signed this, and of course the United States government knew what they had in mind. The native folks perhaps are being too trusting and not really knowing what would come of this particular treaty here for that. And again, while this talks about the Choctaws, many of the southeastern tribes signed this treaty